Hi, welcome to the channel where we provide an alternative view to the common narrative. Today I would like to talk about the main event that is in the news, and that is the huge earthquake that Turkey and Syria has experienced. And today, Thursday, the death toll has risen to about 17,000 people. Now, usually when this happens, then there is huge support from the whole world, and humanitarian aid is sent, and people volunteer to go and rescue people. But the question here arises whether the West will really support Syria. Well, Turkey maybe, because it's a partner, but Syria is as a government or a country with which the Western world doesn't approve of the Syrian government. So if you want to listen more, please continue watching. Welcome back to the channel. Well, we all know, or we should have heard by now, about the terrible events in Syria and in Turkey, about the earthquake, and it's a 7.8 on the Richter scale, and it's about 10 kilometers deep. And until today, Thursday, about 17,000 people have died, and they are expected the numbers will rise. The question is is what is the Western countries going to do about it? What is Europe going to contribute to the disaster? What is America going to contribute to the disaster? Because in fact, what they actually have done is, when the Russian SMO started, they decided for humanitarian reason and for sovereignty of certain countries, they're going to support basically Ukraine, and they have pumped into Ukraine more than about $120 billion, according to Stoltenberg, in order to save the people. And yes, we know that during the last 8 years, about 13,000 people have been killed in the Donbass by the militia or the military of Ukraine. But the Western media don't really talk about that. Now, I've listened to some Western commentators, and they state that Russia has killed, I think, 7,000 or 8,000 civilians in Ukraine, maybe even more. And everybody is hoo-ah and lamenting the deaths, which is tragic, and I totally agree with that, if the number is true. But that's not the point. The point is that innocent people have died. And the West is opening their purses, the wallets, spending money that they can't really afford, and that's all hunky-dory. While we have now 17,000 people killed, that's more than double what is in Ukraine in the last 11 months. And what is the West going to do? And my assessment is that the West is not going to help, because the West are hypocrites. Say one thing and then they do another thing, and you should rather judge them according to their actions and not according to what they are saying. For some other reason, they have decided in 2011 that Assad must go. Assad, that is the head of the Syrian government. And he's abusing his people and so on, in the same way that Gaddafi was doing in Libya, alleged doing in Libya, which also later turned out is to be all false. Libya and Gaddafi never massacred its people. and so did neither Syria do or Assad do. And the West have funneled their weapons into it, and then later implemented sanctions and even bombarded to an alleged chemical attack, which we know now never happened, where innocent people were killed again by a Western nation. So why would they help now? Currently, they're still occupying part of Syria. They're still bombarding Syrian forces, not ISIS, Syrian forces. They're stealing the oil from Syria. Something that is happening still and is happening now. When the Russian SMO started, everybody wanted to ignore everything else in the world and say, yeah, but Putin is now killing people. Well, at the same time, America was at that time still killing Syrians. And in the same sense, we could have talked about Yemen, which was financed by the Americans and British people and allowed Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen, where at that stage, and I'm talking about 2 years ago, the number was already 350,000 civilians that have died due to the bombing or due to starvation and the embargo that was placed and enforced by the American Navy. Why? Because the West is hypocritical. So when the Russian SMO started, then the Russian Navy blockaded Odessa and so on in order to prevent military equipment to enter Ukraine. But the Ukrainian military then mined the Odessa port. And due to that, the ships that were actually anchored, civilian ships that were anchored in Odessa and other ports, could not leave. And due to that, then there was this grain issue that couldn't leave Ukraine. But it did leave Ukraine via trucks and railways. So it's not that the whole food that Ukraine could supply to the world was stopped. No, it was actually continued just by different means. And then there was an agreement in September last year with the Russians after huge mounting pressure that Russia is starving the world from food and grain, and Russia is starving the food from the world from fertilizers. But it was the West that implemented sanctions against that. And later it turned out that most of the food that later was exported via Odessa actually went to Europe and not to the poor African countries. So again, a hypocritical act. So it amazes me to see that people still trust the West when it talks about humanitarian ideals. Human rights, the poor must be supported. Because everything that they do, they are not doing it. And now there is a call by China that America and Europe must lift the sanctions against Syria in order to assist with the humanitarian crisis that has developed. But America again refuses to do that. Why would you punish a country, the civilians, when you are against the government who was elected by the people, but who you decided you don't agree with, and then you implement sanctions against the government for some other reason? Well, we have to ask ourselves, where's democracy, the principle of democracy and self-determination and all the other goodies that is in the UN Charter? But America and the West just ignored it because it doesn't suit their narrative and their objective, going against their own perceived so-called values. And they are not going to lift the sanctions. And who's going to suffer? The Assad regime? No. The civilians that are now hit by this earthquake and by the people that are still trapped underneath the rubble, and the food shortages and all the other water shortages and all the other stuff that goes with it. So whatever you talk about, the sanctions are now against the civilian population of Syria. Well, Turkey as well. But Turkey is not under embargo. Syria is. So the question again arises, what are the Western people talk about? What are they meaning when they are talking about human rights, human suffering? The poor people must be assisted. Humanitarian aid, humanitarian concerns. What the fuck? You can even abandon the whole principle of global warming. Because the principle of global warming is in order to protect the civilian population, not the governments. So if you want to focus on green energy and global warming, and that's a one-sided farce that you are trying to promote. And you want us to suffer and sacrifice our living standards, etc., 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 just to have a half-hearted effort on humanitarian assistance in terms of protecting the future of our children. By the way, have you ever noticed that the male person has no value? If people talk about humanitarian assistance, human rights, protect the civilians, they always talk about protecting the women, the children, and the old people. They never talk about the male figure. I wonder why is that? Is the perception that the male can always fend for himself and defend himself? Well, that's a fallacy, because not everybody, a male, can do it. We are not all soldiers. We are not all Rambos or MacGyvers. Most of the men are, in any case, in similar vulnerable than a lot of the other people. But again, that's the biased, school of sexist type of view. So I'm going to watch for the next couple of days. What is the world going to do? And my assessment is the world's not going to do a lot. They might assist Turkey because it's one of their so-called friends. But the bulk of the aid will come from the East and from Russia. And call it the New South. Whatever the West will supply is a token. And it will be transferred in the form of, say, the UN or stuff like that. But it's time for the West to lift the sanctions, America to move out of Syria and return the oil and the grain fields and whatever other assets of the country of Syria they occupy and control back to the legal government. So today is a little bit short, but that's my story for today. If you want to hear more, subscribe to the channel, tell your friends, and until next time, cheers.